Dinesh D'Souza is the best-selling author of What's So Great About America, Illiberal Education, and The Virtue of Prosperity. Next, he discusses his latest work, Letters to a Young Conservative, with students at the Bancroft School in Worcester, Massachusetts. It's 40 minutes.
Good afternoon. We're happy to welcome you at Bancroft School today to this special talk by our guest visitor, Dinesh D'Souza. Dinesh D'Souza is a best-selling author whose books probe some of the most challenging issues that face America today. Mr. D'Souza is a graduate of Dartmouth College. He has served as a White House policy analyst, and he is currently the Rishwain Research Scholar at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Today he's going to speak with us about his newest book, Letters to a Young Conservative. Please welcome Mr. D'Souza to Bancroft. Thank you.
Thank you all very much. I do want to leave some time for discussion, and so in my opening remarks, I will try to adopt the motto that King Henry VIII used with one of his wives. He said, "I won't keep you long." I'm going to tell you a little bit about my new book, Letters to a Young Conservative. It is a book that tries to understand the main differences between liberalism and conservatism. It distinguishes both from libertarianism. It is also a book that tries to look at how one can answer, as a conservative, liberal arguments about hot-button issues, inequality, the alleged hypocrisy of U.S. foreign policy, the criticisms of America that we hear both from at home and abroad, the controversial issues of affirmative action and reparations, the legitimacy of the issue of gay marriage. There's a whole ensemble of issues, and in the years that I've been speaking at high schools and college campuses, I'm often approached by young people who say, how do I think about this? How do I think rationally about it? How do I engage my opponent on these issues? And that's what this book does. It's a kind of survival guide or primer for conservatives who inhabit liberal environments. I thought I'd begin by telling you a little bit about myself. I am a first-generation immigrant. I was born in Bombay, India. I came to the United States in 1978 as an exchange student. And a year later, I ended up, by a series of coincidences, at Dartmouth College. It was at Dartmouth that I first became interested in politics. A group of students had founded a rebel conservative newspaper called the Dartmouth Review. The Dartmouth Review has been, for the past couple of decades now, a kind of thorn in the side of the Dartmouth administration. In fact, I remember that the students used to tell the deans that taking on the Dartmouth Review was a bit like wrestling with a pig. Not only did it get everyone dirty, but the pig liked it. And what attracted me to the review was not the controversy of it. I come from a very unassuming, non-political Asian American family, if you will. But what interested me about the conservative students at the Dartmouth Review was that I found them to be engaged and interested in some fundamental questions that I had never thought about before. I was very much headed toward majoring in economics, going to business school. And here I found a bunch of students asking questions like, what does it mean to be a liberally educated person? Who belongs to the liberal community? Is there something fundamentally unjust about economic inequality? What do we mean by equality? Do we mean equality of rights or equality of outcomes? And I realized that these questions pressed me to think about questions that I had not mulled about before and encouraged me to read. And so it was that journey that led me ultimately to think about and to feel comfortable in thinking of myself as a conservative, although an independent-minded conservative. Now, part of the Dartmouth Review's controversy on campus was because the newspaper was unremittingly outrageous. And the reason the newspaper was outrageous was for a very simple reason. It is what I would call the conservative dilemma. Think about this. Traditionally, The job of a conservative is to conserve, to maintain the status quo, to hang on to what already exists. But here's the problem. What if you are a conservative in a liberal environment? You obviously can't conserve because you are then going to be conserving the principles of liberalism. So the conservative is in a quandary, and it seems to me that the conservative in a liberal environment cannot remain a conservative in the conventional sense. Rather, the conservative in the liberal environment must be philosophically conservative, but temperamentally radical. In other words, the conservative has got to become a kind of intellectual guerrilla. And by that I mean he has to challenge, to undermine, to question some of the underlying premises of the liberal community. And the Dartmouth Review did this in a rather outrageous way. I mean, when I look back on some of our antics, I'm a little embarrassed now that I'm in middle age, but when people say, well, the Dartmouth Review was so sophomoric, I usually reply, well, yeah, but that's because we were sophomores. When I think back on the review's antics, I remember that we had published a series of articles about complaining about the level of funding that the college was providing to the campus gay students organization. We weren't objecting to the existence of the organization. We were objecting to a college funding a group based on sexual preference. And the college, of course, refused to listen, to pay much attention, and so we said, okay, well, let's test them in their commitment to their principles. If the college wants to fund groups based on sexual orientation, why don't we start here at Dartmouth a bestiality society? And so we did. We assembled a group. We had a chairman, a vice chairman, and a zookeeper. And we went to the college and we said, you know, we want to have recognition and funding. And I remember it was rather comical because the dean at the time said, well, I don't see any need for such an organization here at Dartmouth. There clearly is no interest in the issue of bestiality. And we replied, well, yes, Dean Hanson, that may appear to be so, but isn't that because of centuries of discrimination and prejudice and ostracism and so on? So these were the sorts of stunts that we pulled when we were undergraduates. And no, we didn't get funding from the college, although we did get articles in the local newspapers that dramatized our plight. But the real purpose of the Dartmouth Review was to take the built-in assumptions of campus liberalism, of what we today call political correctness, and to challenge them. So it was an operating assumption, for example, at Dartmouth that affirmative action is an effective way to fight discrimination. And we responded, if affirmative action is an effective way to fight discrimination, how do you effectively fight discrimination by practicing it? Isn't there something ironic, contradictory, ultimately self-defeating about trying to establish a principle of color blindness by engaging in the very discrimination that you are trying ultimately to prohibit? I graduated from Dartmouth in 1983, and I was part of a generation of young people who came to Washington excited by the Reagan Revolution, wanting to be part of that movement because even though we were young, we had a feeling that something very important was going on in politics. The world was changing, and somehow the strange man Reagan was at the center of it. Now, when I say the strange man Reagan, what I mean is that if you read political science textbooks on what a president should be, what his qualifications should be, what his traits should be, you read that a president should be a serious guy. He should know a lot about public policy. He should spend his life preparing for the responsibilities of high office. He should spend 14 hours a day on the job. And you only have to take one look at Reagan to realize he didn't meet any of these criteria. He put in a short day at the office, usually showing up around 9:30 and leaving by about 4. Somebody once asked him, they said, you know, isn't it true that you're putting in a relatively light work day? And Reagan said, well, yeah. He said, you know, they tell me hard work never killed anyone, but why take the chance? Reagan was not a scholar. He spent most of his career as a movie actor. And yet, despite all that, he was making a very large claim. And this large claim I want to suggest is he was fundamentally challenging the principle of collectivism. This was the unifying idea of Reagan's thought. He opposed the collectivism represented in the Soviet Union abroad, and then he opposed the expansion of the welfare state at home. Reagan said, government is not the solution, government is the problem. and there's a certain kind of boldness to this statement. Previous Republicans like Ford and Nixon had kind of made their peace with the welfare state. But Reagan was challenging the idea of the welfare state, and in a sense what he was doing is going up against John F. Kennedy. See, when I first came to America in the 70s, the public ethos had been set by John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy said, if you're young, if you're idealistic, if you care, do what? Join the Peace Corps, become a public servant. And the public servant was the embodiment of American idealism. Reagan challenged that. Reagan said, no, it's not the public servant, it's not the bureaucrat, it is the entrepreneur who represents American heroism and American possibility. And why do I tell you this? Because we have seen a massive shift in the culture in which this Reaganite idea has come to pass. We have seen a shift in the culture in which probably more of your parents want you to be like Bill Gates than Bill Clinton. And that is symptomatic of this shift away from the public servant and toward the entrepreneur. It was also Reagan's idea, if you will, to bring down the Soviet empire. And through a series of marvelous actions and some luck, that was in fact accomplished. And so we are living now at an interesting moment in history in which the Reaganite idea, defeat communism, establish capitalism and entrepreneurship, has been realized. One of the problems faced by the Republican Party today is the dilemma of success. The Reaganite ideas have to some degree been achieved. And so we are now living, if you will, in a kind of post-Reagan world. And what I try to do in this book, Letters to a Young Conservative, is to try to outline what are the new issues and the new challenges that we face in this post-Reagan world. So I want to tell you briefly what those are. First, on the issue of capitalism. It is true that capitalism has won the economic debate. But I want to suggest that it hasn't yet won the moral debate. Look at all the protesters who show up at the anti-globalization events in Seattle and Washington, D.C. It's not as if they are challenging the efficiency of capitalism. They're not. It's not even as if they have an alternative system. They don't. But what they are questioning is the justice, the fairness, the goodness of capitalism. And what is most interesting is that capitalism today is under some assault both from the left and from the right. It is under assault from the left in the name of inequality. You will hear, what about corporate greed? What about the fat cats? Aren't the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer? And on the right, capitalism is criticized for undermining values. Think about Judge Bork's book, Slouching Towards Gomorrah. The idea here is that what we have seen in American society over the past generation is a rising tide of prosperity, to be sure, but accompanied by cultural decline. And the idea here is that capitalism undermines our ties to family and community and God and morality. And this is an issue, I think, that will continue to be debated. And capitalism doesn't win unless it can address these concerns. Well, what about the concern about inequality? Isn't it true that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer in America? I want to suggest that that is, in fact, not true. That what we have seen in American society in the past generation is the rich have gotten richer and the poor have also gotten richer, but not at the same pace. So yes, inequality is greater. But what America has done, essentially, is taken a lot of people who are in the middle class, or the lower middle class, and extended to them the benefits of affluence. Let me give you a single statistic that illustrates this point. In 1980, when Reagan was first elected, if you earned $55,000, you were in the top 5% of income earners in America. Seems hard to believe, but true. Today, if you want to be in the top 5%, today you have to earn $160,000. So what does that mean? That means that lots of people who were in the middle or even toward the bottom have moved up. And in moving up, they have increased the gap between themselves and the rest of the population. So yeah, inequality is greater. But what we are missing is an emergence of something very new in America, something that as an immigrant I'm very struck by, the emergence of the first mass affluent class in world history. Think about this. Previously, the great achievement of America was to create the middle class, to take people who are poor and give them basic comfort. But we now live in a society where the privileges of affluence traditionally available only to the very few, are now extended to the mass of the population. So the ordinary guy in America has a remarkably good life. And you might say, well, yeah, but what about the poor? What about the guy left behind? I want to leave you with the thought that capitalism in the long run creates more equality than all the government and philanthropic programs put together. I'll give you a couple of examples of what I mean. 100 years ago, a rich guy would take a horse and carriage, and a poor guy would walk. That is a huge difference. Today, the rich guy might drive a Mercedes. The poor guy might drive a Honda Civic. That is a smaller difference. Or look at another example, life expectancy. 100 years ago, in fact, in the year 1900, the rich guy in America lived to the age of 60. The poor guy dropped dead at the age of 45. There was a 15-year gap in life expectancy between the rich guy and the poor guy. Today, the rich guy lives to the age of 80, and the poor guy in the United States lives to the age of 76. There's still a gap, 4 years. But it is a much smaller gap. And what has closed the gap? What has closed the gap is advances in medicine, and crop yields, and fertilizers, and so on. So technological capitalism, in my view, seen in the larger landscape, is an instrument not only of efficiency, but also of equality. But I do want to concede that there is something about capitalism, there is an element of truth to the conservative concern that capitalism undermines some of our values. And that, it seems to me, is an issue we are struggling with in America today. I was reading not long ago Tom Brokaw's book, The Greatest Generation, which celebrates the virtues of the so-called greatest generation. And I asked myself, what made the greatest generation so great? And it occurred to me, it was the Depression and World War II. All the virtues of the greatest generation came out of scarcity and war. And the reason the greatest generation failed, think about it, the greatest generation did fail in one way. It failed to replicate itself. It couldn't produce another great generation. Well, why not? Seems to me one of the answers is affluence. The parents of the 1930s and 40s wanted their children to have that which they never did. And in giving their children everything they wanted, the frugal and self-discipline and deferred gratification generation of World War II produced the spoiled children of the 1960s. So I think we are struggling today with the issue of how one can maintain moral values of family and community and religiosity, spirituality, in a society that gives us more options, more freedom, and also more affluence. So one way in which the world has changed is the moral debate about capitalism. There's a second way that the world has changed, and that is the emergence of Islamic radicalism as an alternative to Soviet communism as the greatest threat and challenge facing America and the West. In fact, I read an article not long ago saying that our 70-year fight with communism may turn out to be a short detour in the 1500-year argument that Western civilization has been having with Islam, that may turn out to be the more momentous conflict. And there are a couple of indications that that may be so. True, the Soviet Union had nuclear weapons, but what the Soviet Union did not have is true believers. Islamic society has true believers. Consider the case of the suicide bomber. Whatever you think of the suicide bomber, he is a true believer. Even the communists and the Nazis, although they inspired a good deal of fanaticism, could not produce one suicide bomber. Well, the Japanese could produce suicide bombers, but even then the suicide bombers were military men. The Japanese wouldn't convince a mother of two or a student to go blow himself or herself up. So the true believing phenomenon, I think, is part of what gives Islamic radicalism its potency. Communism can't even compete with that. In fact, by the time the Berlin Wall fell, there were virtually no true believers left in the Soviet Union. If you wanted to find a real Marxist, you would have to go to the Department of Romance Languages at Oberlin College. So we are faced with this threat of Islamic radicalism, a threat that ultimately is questioning the American idea of the self-directed life. See, the core idea of America is the idea that here in this country we are the architect of our own destiny. The Islamic idea, by contrast, is that somebody else should steer or direct or guide you in the way you live your life. And the American idea is very threatening to the elites in the Islamic world, because the American idea is saying to the Islamic wife or son, you don't have to listen to the male head of the household. You don't have to listen to the mullahs or the Sharia, the holy law, maybe not even to Allah. You are in the driver's seat of your own life. This, I believe, is a very troubling and ultimately frightening idea to the elites in the Islamic world. In a way, my book, Letters to a Young Conservative, is an attempt to make sense of this new world in which we live. You are coming of age at a time when the old challenges have faded away, and new challenges are coming to the forefront. You're faced with issues like the environment, issues like inequality, issues like the campaign for public legitimacy on the part of the gay rights activists. And the gay rights movement, like the feminist movement, is piggybacking on the moral momentum of the civil rights movement. So how, as young people, are you to think about these things, and how, in a liberal culture, can one stand up for conservative views? I want to leave you with a thought that, in my view, in today's culture, which is predominantly a liberal culture. Politically, we're not in a liberal culture. Politically, the world has moved in a conservative direction. But I think in our institutions of higher learning, our colleges, our schools, by and large, we have a liberal culture. And to me, the great value of conservatism in that culture is it begins to question things at the root level. In other words, to be a liberal today is to go with the flow. To be a liberal today is to be a conformist. Someone once spoke about the herd of independent thinkers syndrome, and that characterizes modern liberalism. To me, the intellectual value of conservatism is that it is a way of forcing yourself to question things at the root level, to turn assumptions into questions, so that, in my view, the real free thinkers, the real dissenters, the real independent-minded young people today are, in fact, implausible though it sounds, the conservatives. Thank you very much. Thank you. We have time for discussion. Please don't be shy, but speak up. Any thoughts, any questions, please?
First, Mr. D'Souza, let me say that you're a phenomenal public speaker. Second, I may have misunderstood you, but I think that when you were talking about the Reagan administration, that you said that you agree with Reagan and that he said that government and therefore welfare is a problem. You later said that the poor are getting richer, but I personally believe that this is because of welfare. How can you sort of account for the fact that the poor are getting richer and say that it's not because of welfare?
Look, I don't deny that government benefits have made a difference in alleviating poverty. They have made a difference in improving safety. I am not arguing the case that the government has no role to play in a society. But I do think it's important to understand that the government role in a society should be inherently suspect. Here's why. Imagine this is the following scenario. I am walking by the riverbank eating my sandwich. You are hungry, and you come up to me and you say, could I please have half of your sandwich? I give you half. Now, this transaction, it seems to me, has great moral value. Here's why. I have done a good thing. I rightly feel good about myself. You feel a sense of debt, of gratitude. You may not be able to repay me, but someday if you're in a position, you might help somebody else. So there is a moral value in this voluntary exchange. Now consider the following, the same example. You come up to me, I'm eating a sandwich, and I say, I don't want to share. And a third guy comes up, and he puts a gun to my head, and he says, give me your sandwich or I'll blow your head off. So I hand over my sandwich, and then he, the government, gives it to you and says, here, welfare. Now, I would suggest that the outcome is the same. You end up with my sandwich. But the moral value of the transaction is totally different. First of all, I am a reluctant contributor. I don't want to give. I'm only giving because there's a gun to my head, so there's no virtue in it for me. Similarly, you are not getting it from me. You are getting it from the government, so you don't feel grateful. You feel entitled. You go, yeah, where's, this is only half a sandwich? Where's the rest? So here's what I'm suggesting, that although the government is producing a beneficial result, it is stripping the moral value of the transaction and creating, if you will, a different moral dynamic that seems to me much less healthy than if I had given you the sandwich in the first place. So it is the element of coercion that distinguishes government. You know, people sometimes say, well, don't we need big government to counter big business? But see, to me, yes, I mean, big business is not innocent by any means, but here's the big difference. Big business, if they want my business, say Michael Dell, if he wants me to buy his computer, what does he have to do? He has to buy silly ads, go on television, say, please buy my computer. I've got to get in my car, go down to the mall, or get on the phone, order the computer, and so on, right? I've got to do all that voluntarily, and I wouldn't do it if I didn't think the computer was a good value. But by contrast, even the slightest government official, the parking meter attendant, the guy at the DMV, the immigration official, the tax collector, in a way, they have a lot more power over me than Michael Dell. Why? Because they have the power of coercion. I'll give you one example of what I mean. Consider the example of Social Security. And I'm an immigrant. I've come to this country since the 70s. What if I were to say, you know, I hear you've got this wonderful program in America to help me save for my retirement, Social Security. But, you know, having thought about it, I don't think I'm going to want it. In other words, I do not want to make these Social Security contributions, and I forego any claim to benefits. So from now on, I'm not going to be paying any Social Security contributions, and when I get old, I will look after myself or rely on my family or private charity, or I'll starve in the street. Now, what would the government say? The government would say, no, you better pay those Social Security contributions, because if you don't, we're going to kill you. You might think I'm exaggerating, but I'm not, because see, if I didn't pay my Social Security taxes, what would they do? They would impose fines, and the fines would keep multiplying. And ultimately, the FBI agents would come to get my house. And then I would try to defend my house and reach for my handgun or whatever from my drawer, but since I'm a poor shot and there are more of them, they would have my house and I would be dead. So my point is, there is something inherently coercive in the nature of government that I think as defenders of freedom, we should be careful about. That's not to say no government, but skepticism toward government seems to me very warranted. Any questions, thoughts? Please.
I had a question to your, you talk about income disparities in the world and what it leads to. I myself am from a European environment, Germany to be exact, and you say that if I talk with Americans about the topic of schools, for example, the school system, that a public school system, the American dream, everyone can rise from the lowest position to the highest power, which is true, and I agree. That's a very great ability of the American society. But that person who does that has to be sort of an exception. The normal average guy in this society will get, if I say he goes to a public school, will get his education there. But this same exact guy going to Bancroft School, paying a huge tuition, may get a much better job afterwards, better education, better chances, and therefore maybe the richer position. So what I'm proposing is that it's sort of, although you can reach that position, it does not necessarily mean that the whole community can get it. And therefore in the income disparities, it's sort of, I don't know, it seems sort of unfair for those people, because if I come here and I can afford Bancroft, I can have the best education in the world. On the other hand, if I can't, I will have probably worse than many other European countries who have maybe not the total wealth as America has.
Yeah, there are two aspects that you raised I want to address. One is the distinction between Europe and America. And it is true that in certain indices, Europe comes out ahead of America. For example, Europe has a bigger safety net. European countries typically have healthcare plans. European countries engage in a lot more social welfare services than the United States. You can say that Europe has purchased more security, and by security I mean the safety net, than America. America offers less security, but I think in my view more social mobility and more opportunity. In Europe, if you see a rich guy, chances are that he comes from a rich family. In America, virtually all, in fact, the authors of the book, The Millionaire Next Door, estimate that 80% or more of self-made millionaires in America inherited nothing. That they created, if you will, their own wealth. And so America, if you will, gives you less safety, less security, but I think genuinely more opportunity. Now, on the issue of schools, you are right, but I don't think for the reason you give. In other words, there is inequity in the school system, and there is a difference between the public and the private schools, but in my view, it is not primarily a function of money. Recently, an official in the Washington, D.C. Department of Schools, which spends, by the way, a lot of money, was asked, isn't it true that the Washington, D.C. schools are a disaster? And he said, oh no, they are a big success. He said, lots of people work here. Now think about this. What the guy is saying is, measured by the standard of creating employment, the school system is a resounding success. Education was a rather low on his list of priorities, apparently. So, but you might say, well, yeah, but why? And I think the answer is this. The answer is accountability. See, in the private schools, if they don't perform, your parents could send you elsewhere. In other words, it is the existence of choice and competition that forces the private school systems to be accountable. Now, there are some public schools that are accountable because you have parents who are actively involved, but the public schools that are in the biggest problems are the inner city schools, where parental involvement is often less or minimal. You have single-parent families, the difficulty of parents being actively involved in the school. So the school system is accountable to no one. In fact, it's not even accountable to the social activists who are always trying to make society better. When is the last time Jesse Jackson held a sit-in at a public school to demand that the superintendent resign because the test scores are too low? Never happens. So I think that the problem with the public schools is the problem of accountability. Look, 20 years ago, if you walked into the American post office, you got the same psychology that you see in the public schools. The post office is a lot better today. Why? There's a two-word answer. Federal Express. The existence of competition of other people who will deliver the mail. Today you walk into the post office, it's a highly entrepreneurial place. They're trying to sell you different types of stamps, and you can make contributions and this and that and registered mail. So competition, if you will, I think makes public institutions better. So what I'm calling for here is the introduction of some element of competition. And some people say, well, that'll destroy the public schools. Think about that. If competition and choice will destroy the public schools because everybody will leave and go elsewhere, what does that tell you? It seems to me the public school system does need that kind of electric shock to make it more effective, or go out of business. Yes?
Because you're a skeptic of the government, how would you feel about U.S. involvement in a war with Iraq? A very crafty question, which is, as a conservative, you criticize the government, but what about the Defense Department? And what about the CIA? And my answer is, whatever the government does, it does badly. The conservative should not think that because you have a defense establishment, it's going to be inherently more efficient than, let us say, the Department of Motor Vehicles. Now, we try to make the government efficient, and I would argue that the Defense Department, like the police department, performs a necessary function in the liberal state. I mean, think about it. If you think about the idea of the social contract, why do we come together as a society? The fundamental reason we come together as a society is to protect ourselves and our rights from foreign thugs and domestic thugs. So the first thing the government should do is protect our borders, protect our defense, and protect us from crime. Then it can think about other things. Well, to me, the sad thing is that these fundamental things the government hasn't been doing that well. 9/11 is only one illustration of that, but high crime rates in America, higher than in most countries in Europe except England, are an example of this. So I would like to see the government do better what it's supposed to do, and worry less, and then perhaps start giving some thought to other things that it should take on. But its fundamental duties are going neglected. So conservatism today it's not radical libertarianism. The radical libertarian wants to, he wants to run up and down the street pulling out every stop sign he sees. He doesn't think the government should do anything. The conservative criticism of government is more pragmatic. For example, I sometimes will read in libertarian magazines, the drug war is a failure. Okay? But the difference between the libertarian and the conservative is the conservative will say, well, what if the drug war
could be a success? What if, with relatively prudent policies, we could severely reduce the amount of use of drugs? My point is that the radical libertarian will oppose the drug policy all the more, because the radical libertarianism does not think the government should be in the business of regulating drugs. The conservative, by contrast, is willing to consider the possibility of the government being involved, but shares with the libertarian the skepticism about how the government is involved, and is always very prudent about restricting the sphere of government and protecting the sphere of rights. In that sense, conservatism is a defense of the principles of the American founding, which is to say, of the classical liberalism of the American founding. But what we call liberalism has broken with the American founding in two ways. I would call it the FDR revolution, the revolution of the welfare state, and the moral revolution of the 60s. The American founders, for example, believed that even though we have freedom, economic, political, freedom of religion and speech, that there is a moral order in the universe external to us that makes claims on us. They never denied the existence of that order. But in the 60s, you had a new idea, which is a denial of external authority and an emphasis on the inner self as the adjudicator of moral choice. So that people will say, I don't want to decide based on what my teacher says or my preacher or even God. I want to consult my inner self. This is the revolution of autonomy, of self-fulfillment. These are the guiding principles of modern contemporary liberalism. And conservatism, by contrast, is devoted to protecting the ideas of economic freedom, political freedom, but also with a concern for civic virtue. Also with a concern of civic decency, having a society in which the incubators of virtue, particularly among the young, the Boy Scouts, the family, civic intermediate institutions between the individual and the state, those are protected and sustained. So that, in my view, is the role of a contemporary conservatism. Yes, please.
You mentioned before that you found affirmative action to be ironic. Could you go into a little more depth of why and maybe give some examples?
The question is about affirmative action. I have a whole chapter that is a kind of primer on the issue of affirmative action in Letters to a Young Conservative. And I want to just say a word about affirmative action because, well, let's put it this way. Consider a hypothetical. A black guy and a white guy apply for a job. The black guy is better qualified. The white guy gets the job. That is racial discrimination. Now here's the second case. A black guy and a white guy apply for a job. The white guy is better qualified. The black guy gets the job. That is affirmative action. Now the defenders of it will say, well, yeah, but you see, the second case is needed to remedy the first. But see, to me, all I see are two cases of racial discrimination, both of them equally reprehensible. So it seems to me the issue here is not a defense of white privilege, which I'm against, but rather a defense of the idea of non-discrimination, a defense of the idea of colorblindness against both white privilege and racial preferences for minorities. I think what we need in America is the encouragement of the meritocratic idea. I mean, I recognize in life that not everything is decided by merit, but the greatness of America is it tries to push and strengthen the meritocratic idea against the nepotistical or favoritism idea. And I'd like to see that trend strengthened in law and public policy. So my concern with affirmative action is the initial impulse of it was good. In fact, initially, by the way, affirmative action was only intended for one group. Blacks, because of a specific set of historical crimes. But what happened in the late 60s and then the 70s is that other groups came along, the Hispanics, the women's rights groups, the gay rights groups, some immigrant groups, and they all said sort of, we are the new blacks. And if you go back to the history, you will see that the black leaders in the beginning, they said, wait a second, excuse me, were you enslaved? Were you victimized by Jim Crow? Were you a victim of state-sponsored segregation? No. But see, then a second camp spoke up in the civil rights movement and said, listen, we should let all these guys climb on the bandwagon because we blacks are a small minority. We are going to be beholden to white goodwill to continue racial preference programs. But if we let in the Hispanics, they are 10%. And then women, they are 50%. We will have a political majority. We can keep voting to have racial preferences forever. So my point is that the affirmative action, the politics of affirmative action evolved in a way that strengthened the political coalition but weakened the moral case for affirmative action by allowing in other groups that have a much weaker moral claim than African Americans. Time perhaps for one more question, if there is one. If not, let me just say that I think that as young people, you are, especially as you set foot into college, you find yourself in an environment where a kind of dogmatic liberalism is often very powerful. And one of the ironies to me is the more selective the college, the more entrenched that kind of liberalism. So it seems to me that your job is to develop the tools, the weapons, to be able to puncture and question and examine that liberalism. Even if at the end you end up embracing it, you will at least have strong arguments to do that. And not submit to a kind of flaccid intellectual liberalism that will leave you poorly prepared for the world. So the purpose of this book is to give you that kind of intellectual ammunition so that you are better prepared to face the political challenges that you are bound to face in the years ahead. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Dinesh D'Souza is author of Letters to a Young Conservative. It's published by Basic Books, on the web at basicbooks.com.